Welcome everyone. For those of you I haven't met, I'm Kevin Kenny. I'm the director of Glucksman Ireland House. As you know, normally we would be holding this event on a lively Thursday evening in Manhattan, followed by drinks and conversation downstairs. So you'll have to provide your own drinks today, I'm afraid. But one big advantage of meeting at this time is that we can attract an audience here in New York and an audience in Ireland at the same time, or for that matter, an audience anywhere. So all of our public events in Ireland House this semester, and this is the first, nearly all of them will be in this time slot, kicking off at 12:30 New York time, 5:30 Dublin time. And the highlights of the calendar we're putting together, starting of course with today's event, include an upcoming launch of Roy Foster's new book on Seamus Heaney, another lecture on Heaney delivered by Louise Richardson. That's an Irish Institute lecture. We have an Ernie O'Malley lecture on Daniel Cohollan by Michael Durley. We're collaborating on a symposium with Georgetown on Frederick Douglass. We have two events in our Black, Brown and Green Voices with Kimberly McLean da Costa and Brian Dooley. A number of other events we're planning too, so just check the website, please, for information on that and for updates. This is not a time when we're putting out a paper calendar for obvious reasons. But today, we have the great pleasure of launching the 6-volume set, Irish Literature in Transition, published this year by Cambridge University Press, which traces the evolution of Irish writing from 1700 to the present. And it's worth pausing just to note the scale and ambition of that. Irish literature as a whole, in its contested, uneven and transnational development through the modern era, told in 6 volumes, each featuring the best new scholarship and the best work of established authors. And we are delighted today to welcome the 2 general editors of the series, Professor Marjorie Howes and Professor Claire Connolly, 2 of the most significant figures in current Irish literary scholarship, whom I'm also honored to count as friends and colleagues. Both of them also edited 1 volume in the series of their own. The other volumes were edited by Moira Haslett, Matthew Campbell, Eve Patton, and jointly Paige Reynolds and Eric Falchi. There they are. Some of you can see that screen. And some of the co-editors may be in the audience today, and some of the various contributors. So how we're going to do this is my colleague, Dr. Kelly Sullivan, will introduce Marjorie and Claire and moderate a brief conversation with them, after which we're going to open up a general discussion. So let me wrap up my brief remarks by introducing Kelly Sullivan. Kelly is a clinical associate professor here at NYU's Center for Irish and Irish American Studies. She specializes in literary modernism and late modernism, the focus on fiction and poetry in the mid-20th century. Also works on modern Irish art, contemporary Irish poetry, and most recently issues of environment or eco-critical writing. She's published several essays, articles, and chapters in these areas, as well as publishing poetry of her own. So I will now turn things over to Kelly, and she will explain the format of today's event. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Kevin. It's my honor to be able to moderate this discussion and introduce Claire and Marjorie, who I also have the pleasure of counting as friends. But I wanted to start with 2 announcements. The first is on the format. So what we had planned to do is use the chat function, and we welcome your questions throughout the presentation today. We will be having a discussion for the first, say, 30 minutes or so, but we'll take your questions via chat the whole way through, and we'll kind of compile them and then turn to audience questions during the event. So do use the chat function. You will be, just so we can hear the presenters, everyone will be muted, so we won't be taking questions audibly, but you're able to send them in to us. And then the second announcement is that Cambridge University Press has offered us a discount, a 20% discount on the volumes if you're attending today's event. And we are sharing, I believe that link has already been shared in the chat, so David shared that for us. So you can click on that link if you want to purchase any or all of the volumes. I highly recommend them at a discount. And that's good through, I believe, through November. So you have some time to think about it and peruse your options. So I'm going to begin by introducing Marjorie and Claire. Claire Connolly is a professor of modern English and head of the School of English at University College Cork. She's also a member of the Royal Irish Academy and a fellow of the Learned Society Wales, and her research and writing includes a 2011 monograph, A Cultural History of the Irish Novel, 1790 to 1829, as well as many, many journal articles and book chapters. She's the editor of several edited collections as well, including the 2005 Cambridge Companion to Modern Irish Culture and Theorizing Ireland in 2002. She's also edited editions of work by Mariah Edgeworth, Sidney Owenson, and Mena Gali. And she's also, I think she has a forthcoming edition of Joseph Sheridan Le Fanu's Uncle Silas, one of my favorite novels, so I'm excited about that. And Claire's work also includes significant engagement with the environmental humanities, including a 2018 project called Deep Maps, West Cork Coastal Culture. That was an Irish Research Council funded web project where you can explore the coastline through maps and media and environmental studies from 1700 to 1920. And in looking through Claire's list of publications, I was really struck anew by how just the range of her research and work, from Irish Romanticism through mapping projects of all sorts to contemporary literature. And Claire is currently leading a European Union EDRF funded project on ports past and present. Marjorie Howes is Associate Professor of English and Irish Studies at Boston College, where she's also the director, I believe, of the PhD program. Marjorie's books include Yeats's Nations, Gender, Class, and Irishness in 1996, and Colonial Crossings, Figures in Irish Literary History in 2006. She's also been an editor for many books, including Volume 4 of the Field Day Anthology of Irish Writing, the Cambridge Companion to W.B. Yeats, and most recently, Yeats and Afterwards, which she co-edited with Joe Valenti. And her publications also show this immense range of research within Irish studies and beyond, including essays and articles on the Gothic, on material culture, 20th century art, and the arts and crafts movement, and the Irish literary revival, as well as major figures from Dion Boucicault to Joyce and Yeats. And I make a particular note of the range of research that both Claire and Marjorie have engaged with, because I can't think of anyone, any two people more prepared to edit such an ambitious project as the Cambridge Transitions in Irish Literature is. These are volumes that cover 300 years of Irish writing, 320 years if we want to be precise, because they go right up to our inauspicious year of 2020. These volumes are dedicated to significant interventions in Irish studies broadly, but they also, I think they really help us reshape our conceptualization of the survey or the canon of Irish literature. I don't want to say too much about the volumes because that's obviously the subject of our discussion today, but I did want to just say that from the series introduction, Claire and Marjorie write that together these books generate alternative genealogies across time and space and help readers to understand and interrogate the ways in which one period reimagines and reimagines another. So I guess this brings me to my first question for you, and maybe I'll aim this at Marjorie to start us off, which is probably the biggest question. In surveying 300 years of Irish literature, why did you choose this approach, and why are these volumes important to us now? So the why this, why now question.
Thanks, Kelly. I want to start by just thanking Kevin and NYU and Kelly for doing this launch for us, and also thanking everybody in the audience who turned up to help us celebrate. It's kind of ironic, I think, that it took us 3.5 years to produce these volumes, and we had launches planned all over the world, and of course they came out in March, right, just when the world was shutting down. So we're very grateful for this chance. The why this, why now? I'll start with why now, I guess. One of our main objectives was to kind of illustrate that literary history to literary past is a moving target. And that's always true. But it seemed to me that it's especially true right now for a couple of reasons. And those reasons sort of indicate some of the transitions that we were thinking of as we put the project together. So first of all, I think we're seeing a number of transitions in contemporary scholarship. We are really we're no longer in the period when post-colonial models and perhaps debates over post-colonial models to some extent dominated the field. I think we're really moving away from that era into an era that's characterized by a wide range of very diverse approaches. So things like disability studies or eco-criticism or new materialism, queer studies. There's all kinds of new things happening in the scholarship. Second, I think we're seeing other transitions that have been produced by the growing amount of material that's available for us to kind of group under the heading of Irish literature. It's growing in terms of how much we have access to. It's also growing in terms of how varied it is. So new archives are kind of constantly coming online. And there's a lot of recovery work going on that keeps kind of reshaping our sense of literary history. In terms of why this, I think it's significant that so much of the new material that becomes available is available digitally. And it kind of brings up the question, what's the place of a survey in the digital age? One of the kind of signal features of a survey is that you have space constraints. You have to synthesize, you have to leave stuff out, you have to generalize. And we were very aware of this. We felt this very keenly, in fact, when we were putting together the project. And we produced 6 volumes. We could easily have produced 6 more. I mean, God forbid, but given the amount of material that is available to us, anyway, it would be possible. So, in the digital realm, to some extent, you don't have space constraints. And there's great opportunities there, but also great challenges for researchers, but also for students who nevertheless need ways of kind of navigating through all this material. So you have to keep making maps through it, and yet you're aware that no single map you produce will be definitive. So we were kind of taking this opportunity to rethink a little bit what a survey is, what does it do, what does it mean to try and survey a field. And one of the things that we kind of arrived at was that we wanted to survey where the field is going, what's emerging. We wanted not to sum up what has been done in the past, but to kind of look ahead a little bit to the emergent and hopefully to other kinds of work that may be provoked by what we've done.
The one thing that strikes me through the volumes is how great they are as teaching aids in teaching a survey course. But at the same time, there are so many topics that you cover or that the authors cover in the volumes that you still have to be selective. And you also chart transitions, not just in literature and literary genealogies, but really transitions in culture, in Irish culture, and kind of the concept of Irish culture. Claire, I wonder if you could speak to that point at all.
Yeah, I suppose I would just follow up a little bit first on what Marjorie was saying, because one of the things in which we're fortunate in Irish studies more generally, and in the study of Irish literature especially, is the kind of maturity of the field. We have so much work now, and it's a kind of a combination of sort of monumental authoritative books like the Cambridge History of Irish Literature, for example, or the Field Day anthologies, and then more sort of fluid and moving kind of interventions. So when everybody noticed the imbalance in the representation of women, for example, in the Cambridge Companion to Irish Poets, or the absence of women from the Abbey programme in 2016, leading to Waking the Feminists. So that sort of mix of these kind of like I say, sort of monuments of scholarship and this kind of quicksilver moving cultural field requiring rapid interventions when seemingly things suddenly aren't fixed at all, was one of the reasons we were drawn to the kind of transition idea. And to revert then to your more particular question, Kelly, of course, the books came out into a time of incredible change. And at the start, we were just thinking about before we saw the books, but we heard they were out in February. We were listening to the news of the February general election here in Ireland, unprecedented change. Everyone said at the time, historic victories for Sinn Féin, looking like the kind of breakup of the two parties stranglehold in Irish politics that we've had for so long. And the idea of these books coming out into this atmosphere of change was really kind of appealing and interesting. The kind of changes we saw in March then were less appealing and altogether more scary, of course. And just shows you, how hard it is to kind of fix the moving target that Marjorie is talking about. But in a sense, the kind of almost dizzying pace of social change in Ireland that Paige Reynolds and Eric Falchi write so well about in the 1980 to 2020 volume really did give shape to the whole series, including going right back to 1700, for example.
On that topic, or kind of thinking of the 6 volumes together as a whole, there is some sense of a narrative drive, I suppose. I mean, despite focusing on moments of change and transition and the kind of rapid change that so many different essays highlight, I think we also see a narrative revealed through that process. So Marjorie, do you want to speak at all to how we kind of formulate or engage more consciously with a narrative through these volumes, or a new narrative or new narratives, maybe in plural, in Irish literature through these volumes?
Well, I think one of the things that we were trying to do was to shape the series in ways that, rather than offering a single narrative, would offer kind of multiple narratives, or would set multiple narratives kind of next to one another. So one of the things that we did in terms of the organization of the series was there are lots of ways to kind of carve up a survey. You can organize it by genre or theme or author. And we didn't want to choose one of those. We wanted a mix of kind of principles or categories in terms of organization. And I think part of the idea there was that, again, surveys are selective. You have to put them together some way. But if we use multiple principles of organization, we can, on some level, we can kind of gesture towards volumes we didn't put together, right? We could have done X or Y. We ended up doing Z. So it's tricky to try and suggest kind of what you didn't do, but we were very much going for a sense of self-conscious, a kind of coverage that could also speak to or be shadowed by decisions that we made and selections that we had to make. So I would say very much sort of multiple narratives and possible narratives as opposed to a single overarching narrative. can I say one more thing about sort of narrative? Yeah, okay. One thing that I think the volumes do have in common, most of them, is that they think about narrative in a different way as well. In other words, I think we were quite conscious of kind of literature's public face, right? The way that literature exists and functions and has power in the world. If we kind of think about the question, like, why study Irish literature? It sort of takes you back to the question of why study literature? So why study it at all? And like, certainly in this country, we have a certain crisis in the academia around that question. So one thing that I think we were pretty careful to try and do in most of the volumes was to track the institutional developments and contexts in scholarship and in the academy in which literature is studied. Sort of developments in those. So for example, my volume, 1880 to 1940, that period sees the beginning of a lot of the major institutions that we think of as cultural and academic institutions in Ireland. So the end of that volume, I have two essays by Jerry Smith and Peter Kutsch, one of them about the development of criticism in the period, and then the other one is about the kind of rise of global Irish studies institutionally all over the world. So narrative also in the sense of something that's out there in public, sort of working in the world, both for better and occasionally destructively, as we see, say, again, on, say, social media or something.
Yeah, in I guess a kind of related question, I really like that idea of the kind of the surveying the institution of Irish studies as well, and the public facing aspect of that. And one of the things that I think all of the volumes touch on or engage with in different ways is Irish studies and Irish literature as it comes into contact with kind of what would more broadly think of as literary categories, so literary aesthetics, I guess. So I saw certain, I suppose, themes or categories emerging through the volumes, including Claire, in your volume, and then in some, and earlier in later volumes, the question of, say, Irish Romanticism. What is that? How is it different from British Romanticism? Or, and modernism also comes up time and again, and new perspectives or new definitions of what that is. The same with realism. I thought that it was fascinating that the question of realism comes up in relation to, I believe, Mariah Edgeworth's writing, and later in a post-war context, post-war context, in kind of what we would have thought of as counter-revival writing in the past. So I don't know if you have any, I would love us to get into some of the specifics of some of the essays, just to give the audience a sense of what's included in the volumes, because they are so rich. So
yeah, I suppose one way to start doing that is to think about that kind of interplay between, imaginative writing and the work of criticism, which is a sort of a big question. And in Eve Patton's volume, which goes from 1940 to 1980, there's Sean Richards' essay about the kind of formation and the shaping of Irish literature in that period. So not just the literature that was written between 1940 and 1980, but the criticism that was written, including, for example, the role of American scholars in shaping certain ideas of what Irish literature meant in that period. But that interplay is kind of always present. And one of the things we learned, or I certainly learned in putting the books together, was how much writers and authors and books themselves intervened in the shaping of a critical language. So it's not something that kind of comes from the outside and then we apply to the literature. So I talk about in my volume how the term romanticism, for example, was in the OED, the Oxford English Dictionary, they attribute the first use of that to the Irish writer Lady Morgan. And Swift famously gives us the first use of modernism in the OED. Oliver Goldsmith talks about the Augustan age, so terms that went on to be kind of almost invisibly neutrally applicable across a wide range of literary contexts, actually interestingly often emerge in Irish contexts. And so there's almost this kind of precocious self-awareness of Irish literature about what it is itself, what it's intervening in, what it's doing. And of course, if you think about where such a precociousness would come from, it's to do with the clash of cultures, the emergence of something that we now call Irish literature in the context of the Anglicization of the island of Ireland since 1700. And so you can keep running those kind of creative, critical questions, I suppose. And a final thing to say about that is, you know, if you go back to my thing about the kind of the monumental authoritative works of scholarship and then the Quicksilver debates, a kind of third point in that triangle, if you like, then is of course the incredible flourishing of contemporary Irish writing. We're always being told it's a golden age of Irish literature, and that does also make us look back to the past.
Mm-hmm. Can I say something about that too, Kelly? In terms of what Claire was saying about so many of the terms and critical procedures that we have in the field arising out of these writers. It's absolutely, that's one of the very important things that the volumes overall track. And I think there's a dynamic between that strand or that narrative, to go back to your word, and another set of things that we did, and that is to question the terms we get from those writers and introduce sometimes new terms. Mm-hmm. So for example, in volume 4, there's a very fine essay by Joe Valente on Yeats's politics, but he doesn't use the terms that Yeats would offer us for his own politics, as we know what those are. Instead, he reads him through disability studies. And that, it seems to me, gives us a whole new way of looking at Yeats and his politics. So tracking the rise of these terms that these writers so precociously give us, and then also turning around and saying, okay, what happens if we employ a different set of terms or a different vocabulary? What can we see about these writers if we do it that way?
That also makes me think of essays on what we would call canonical writers, but the essayists have taken different approaches to their works. I'm thinking of Enda Duffy's article on Joyce, but instead of thinking of Joyce as the urban modernist, he talks about the suburbs. And earlier essays that take a kind of an environmental humanities approach, including an essay, Andrew Carpenter's essay on land and landscape in early Irish poetry. And you mentioned the kind of Anglophone Ireland, but I think it's also important to note that there are several essays that deal with Irish language literature as well, and its importance over these centuries.
Well, it's not the least of the transitions that we see across the centuries. Yeah, of course. And so we try and keep the relationships between the languages in view. And again, it starts to take shape, of course, from the kind of from 1700. The other thing I just wanted to say, Kelly, you made me think about, was just to give people who are listening, and thank you everyone for joining us. We're really, it's lovely to have an audience of people thinking about these issues with us. We adopted dates, we tell the story from 1700 to 2020, and we tried to find dates that didn't necessarily neatly map onto the existing political narrative that we know of Irish history. We're interested in that narrative and we're thinking that through as well. But we didn't go for pre and post famine or pre and post union or after 98 or whatever. And nor did we do the kind of more literary thing, I suppose, either of saying Irish poetry after Yeats or the novel before Joyce or whatever. So we tried to kind of capture broad movements in literary style, and that's why things like Romantic and indeed Victorian for that the 1830 to 1880 volume, and indeed modernism and so on come into view. So we hope that people who would pick up these books and look across the whole would have a sense of the kind of changing aesthetics and movements in style, as well as of course, the engagement with Irish culture and society.
Yeah, absolutely. You're making me think of another kind of parallel project, which is that of, I guess, rediscovering or potentially you know, reviving writers who have been neglected or potentially forgotten. And several essays in the volumes deal with that, I guess, that question. How do we approach writers who have fallen out of fashion? How do we bring them into a survey, for example? So I don't know if there are specific essays you want to talk about in relation to that, or kind of generally as part of the project of these volumes.
Yeah, so in volume 4, for example, there's an essay by Vera Krailkamp on the Ascendancy novel, where she sort of rediscovered a whole slew of now fairly forgotten writers. Fiction by Catholics, fiction dealing with World War I. Many of them were kind of middle-class professional women writers. So really kind of expanding our sense of the genre. And one thing that I think it's important to note there is that very often it happens that those writers were much better known in their own day. And it's not that they were always obscure. They kind of get written out of literary history in the decades following them. So in other words, we're, in that sense, Vera's rediscovering something that people knew at a certain point, and maybe then forgot. On the other hand, she raises the very important question, I think, in the context of all this recovery work that's going on, is the question of value. Is absolutely everything worth recovering? So that's partly a question of how do we integrate and things into something like the survey. Other essays integrate sort of forgotten work in different ways. So when Lauren Arrington rereads Augusta Gregory's work, that's a figure that we're already pretty familiar with, but by reading lesser known works, she kind of refigures how we think about her. Or again, somebody like Paige Reynolds rereading plays by women, now forgotten plays by women, and that makes what we have taken as a kind of conventional contrast between the Abbey, which was fairly traditionalist, and the Gate Theatre, which was supposedly more experimental, that starts to get reconfigured if you pay special attention to the women writers. So there's different ways of integrating the forgotten and the obscure, you know, whether they should be obscure or not, with different results.
That you also, or the volumes also integrate different, I guess, forms of literature or different forms of media that we don't necessarily think of immediately as when we think of Irish literature. Was that a conscious part of the kind of conceptualization of this project? I'm thinking of, in the contemporary volumes, the inclusion of presses, the tramp press. I think Paige writes about tramp press or Irish newspapers, and then earlier volumes like penny posts and you know, popular media forms from those eras. So how did you conceptualize bringing in different kinds of writing in that sense?
In some ways, I suppose the material made its own demands on us. So how could you know, look at Irish writing from 1830 to 1880 and not look at the incredible rise in the popular press? And Stephanie Rains's chapter on that is really quite brilliant in just recovering the sheer range and variety of popular writing, and much of which kind of totally overturns our idea of what was or wasn't Irish culture after the famine. Or also, say, in the earlier period, how could you write about 18th century writing in English and not think of the flowering of 18th century philosophy? And so there's actually quite a few chapters deal with that. And then again to our own contemporary moment, contemporary media, forms of production, film, for example, all have to come in. You can't sort of you know, separate off literature from that. So I suppose maybe it should have been more of a kind of thought through sort of set of propositions, but in a sense we were kind of following the demands that, as I say, the material was making. Yeah,
that makes sense. I thought I'd turn to some of the questions that we're getting through the chat, and some of these, well, some of them touch on topics we've discussed, but kind of expand on them. So a question is, in surveying the canon, what literary voices included in these volumes might surprise us?
That they might surprise us, or?
what literary voices included in these volumes might surprise us. So I guess it's a question both about new voices that have been kind of added into the canon, but maybe also a question about what's surprising about the canonical figures that are included in these essays.
I was really surprised to read the chapter in Marjorie's volume about the Irish literary revival and the telephone. So it's not a voice, I guess, it's a technology, but a sense of how it's how those voices are being mediated as well. But yeah, I'd revert to the example I already gave of Stephanie Rains on the Irish popular press as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think one of the things that we were maybe particularly attuned to was trying to, when we included something that might be surprising, whether it was a writer or a genre, or something like presses, we were trying to identify things that either were emerging, were new, or seemed particularly meaningful in a particular period. So not just the fact that like some of them would be more obscure than others, but also that they had some kind of special significance in the context of the time when they were emerging.
Maybe a pivot to a question about the Irish language coverage in the volumes. What sort of coverage and integration of Irish language literature is included? And could you speak to the increasing importance of the consideration of such Irish language materials in contemporary scholarship represented?
Yeah, that's really interesting. So each volume has to look at that question from its own position. So it's a particular kind of question in 1700. The question is already pivoted and changed by 1780. And so in each case, we try and understand the kind of relationships that are emerging. And I suppose up to the period, up to 1880, really, the first 3 volumes, you're seeing the absolutely wholesale shift from Irish to English and the dominance of English language print media, but you're also seeing this kind of very delicate fabric or tapestry, if you like, of sets of relationships between the 2 languages. So each chapter tries to kind of tell that story in its own way, up to the contemporary as well, exactly as the questioner says, that it's a dynamic and moving situation.
Well, I might add the example from volume 4, which is the Gaelic leagues and the revival's turn to away from classical Irish and towards dialect, and a privileging of the dialect of contemporary Irish speakers, which Brian O'Connor actually treats as part of Europe-wide developments in linguistic thought, right? So even the kind of narratives produced out of Irish language literature often have a kind of European dimension, right? They're not just confined within the space of Ireland.
And just to give another example of the kind of ways in which we approach the question, there's a really interesting chapter in the 1700 to 1780 volume about early Irish novels, which says, cites the kind of critical truism that the first Irish language novel was Shana, published in 1904, and goes back and says, well, yes, but what about the kind of presence of Irish and Hiberno English in some of these kind of polyvocal earlier 18th century novels in English, but that are kind of detailing these very kind of layered linguistic landscapes, if you like, and making them available to us. So there's a kind of back and forth movement.
And the question of Irish language literature, you bring it up right to the 2020, right up to the present with Alva Ngarvi's essay on the contemporary conditions of Irish language literature. So the question persists, I suppose, through all the volumes.
And there we're very lucky to have a poet who's practicing in the language writing as well, yeah.
Another question on, sorry, I've got lots of them here. I've got to sort through them myself. What female writers most influenced or empowered other women to write in the periods that are covered in these volumes?
Well, there's definitely a chapter there for that person in Matt Campbell's volume 1830 to 1880, which it's called The Rise of the Woman Writer. And it looks at the kind of idea, well established by then, that there are kind of senior women, if you like, in Irish letters, and they were Maria Edgeworth especially and Lady Morgan. They're kind of almost falling out of favor by being so respectable actually at that stage. And how they might have motivated other women who followed them, how they might want to break away from them or influence them. It's Anna Pilz's chapter.
Another question on kind of going back to, I guess, reviving or finding authors and texts that have been forgotten. And the question is everything worth preserving? But I wonder if we could also pivot that into more of a conversation around the availability of archival materials and how we sort through everything that has been preserved, and if there are particular articles that pinpoint or particular essays that use the archive in a new and exciting way.
Well, in volume 6, there's an essay by Emily Pine reading the Ryan report through Digital Humanities. So she basically turned it into a kind of database. So that's taking something that we wouldn't even normally necessarily consider literature and using these new technologies and these new methodologies to sort of make it legible in cultural ways that it really wasn't legible before.
That makes me also think of several essays that think of forms of writing, but like the biography and autobiography, and reassess them in the context of Irish studies as well.
Yeah, the example I forgot to give of that earlier when we were talking about it was the Victorian equivalent of the flourishing of philosophical writing in 18th century Ireland was the flourishing of science writing. And so there's material on that as well as Colleen Parsons' great chapter on the Ordnance Survey, or Colin Barr talking about Newman and the idea of a university. So you have to be able to sort of enlarge our understanding of what non-imaginative or what imaginative work is, I suppose, to allow in these other forms.
Another kind of a follow-up or linked question to digital forms and the archive. This is a similar question, but more expanded, I suppose. What were the advantages and disadvantages to you as editors of having literature available in digital form? How does digitization affect the status or definition of an archive? It seems like a particularly pressing question right now, when so much that we want to access, we can only access through digitization, and teaching has become complicated in terms of physical things in front of us.
For me, it goes back to some of the kind of just the basic rules of good scholarship still, which is that if you have material, original or archival material that you want to put on the page and have people read with you, read alongside you, see what you think about it, you have to spend time on it and you have to engage with it. And just simply because you can download great big chunks of a 19th century poem doesn't mean they should just be there on the page. So I suppose the volume is really still about the need for kind of expert, thoughtful, slow, if you like, scholarship on a lot of this new material that's available. And that was something a balance we really tried hard to keep, and so did all the other editors working on the material, whether it's or an 18th century poem.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting how, to go back to kind of the massive amounts of material that are available. If they're available digitally, I agree with Claire, that's not necessarily the happiest form. So that digitization, which seems to be such a boon to scholarship and is in many ways, also presents real challenges. And among them, to go back to a question you asked a minute ago, is everything worth preserving? We can now do that, but what happens when we do it, and in what forms do we preserve things? So for example, early on in digitization, if people digitize journals, they wouldn't do the ephemera or the ads and stuff. And so you get, an incomplete picture. Yeah, I don't know if we drew any profound conclusions about digitization from that, but it was clearly an issue for us sometimes.
I suppose as well we could add, you know, again, in thinking about the sheer availability of material, possibly even outpacing our ability to keep up with it and to analyze it and think about it, there's also still a lot of kind of information shortages and, you know, for example, people working on many aspects of 20th century Irish social history will tell you about blocked archives and places they can't get into. And equally, there's lots of 18th century scholars who will tell you that the pain of the missing page or the sole surviving copy of a manuscript that's now just damaged or destroyed and so on. I mean, not to sound overly romantic about absences or gaps, I suppose, but they propel our thinking as well. And the books, you know, they don't just neatly put literature in these kind of sets of dates. They also kind of ask readers and invite readers to kind of explore gaps and absences as well.
I also think that, you know, going forward, new technologies for preserving things, and this is already happening, you know, as formats become outdated, stuff becomes inaccessible again, right? If something is stored on, I mean, does anyone remember microfilm and microfiche, right? Well, you know, pretty soon we're going to be looking at a world perhaps in which we don't have the technologies to read those things, so they could sort of become unavailable once more. So just the rapid pace of technology poses its own set of challenges.
We have a question that kind of was posted before. You talked about gaps and holes, but it links to that. Have any particular gaps in scholarship emerged, or were you made aware of any significantly underdeveloped areas of study in the field of Irish literature broadly, and how did you address them in the volumes?
Well, I don't mean to sound flippant about it, but I do think we could have probably thought more about literature and Contagion. And it's, as one thinks of it now, there is so much work to do there. So the world has a way of reminding you of things that you just didn't talk about. And there's a lot in the books about environmental history and climate change, especially actually in the earlier volumes, but maybe not enough. Maybe those approaches could be further developed as well.
Another kind of big picture question. Have the editors any conclusions as to what drives transition? Is it uniform across all of the periods in the volumes? And I'm imagining the dates, even the very dates of the volume suggest it's not.
Well, no, no, it's not uniform. And I mean, I think what we were really trying to keep our eyes on was, on the one hand, various kinds of transition in the periods that we were trying to survey. And so we mean, you know, cultural, political, social, technological, and so on. And then simultaneously, we were trying to keep our eye on transitions in our moment right now, transitions in scholarship, other kinds of, say, political or institutional transitions that might affect how we study these periods. So in a sense, we were trying to track and juggle transitions back then and transitions now and see how they interacted.
And you could think about it in terms of the ways in which politics and society force new perceptions of culture, don't they? So in the end of the volume that goes from 1700 to 1780, there's a very clever chapter by James Ward that talks about what 18th century Irish literature came to mean across the centuries. So what did the 18th century mean to the modernists, for example? But in a particular example he gives, which is quite moving actually, is Evan Boland's poem on, what is it called? On rereading Oliver Goldsmith's The Deserted Village in a Changed Ireland. I think the poem is, and the poem locates itself in and around 2005 when the Dundrum shopping centre opened. Some people here might have been shopping to Dundrum or have passed it on the Lewis. and Goldsmith's Lament for Auburn and Loveliest Village of the Plain and so on suddenly is recast by Boland in terms of, you know, the changing Ireland of 2005, the shopping centre going where the green fields were, and so on. So those sorts of new perceptions that are precipitated or forced by changing circumstances are such a kind of powerful driver. And one of the things that we wanted to do in these books was to allow those kinds of crisscrossing lines in literary history to be seen and to take shape, so that even though things are in these kind of containers of dates, if you like, there's also movement between and across.
I think we could also sort of answer that question in relation to the kind of institutional issues that we've been talking about in terms of you know, any given present moment. So, for example, volume 5 actually ends with a whole set of chapters about the various institutions that shaped the reading of literature. So there's biography, there's publishing, there's even a chapter on literature as part of school curricula. And then just kind of the general issue of canon formation. So all those things, I think, would be part of that.
And Margaret Keller has an essay on kind of public value, which seems to fit in that category as well. So.
Yeah, well, one of the really interesting questions that she raises in that essay is the question of what we value. What do we value literature for? Do we value it for as a kind of agent of social cohesion, or do we value it for its disruptive force? And that seems to me to still be quite a live question and worth raising.
And absolutely one of the kind of underlying questions of all of the volumes too. Are you creating kind of literary cohesion, or are you disrupting the field of Irish studies in productive ways with these volumes? A question, another sort of broad view question, what was the most difficult thing about this project, and what was the most unexpectedly rewarding?
One of the most rewarding things, which not entirely unexpected for me, was doing collaborative work. So doing collaborative work with Claire, but also collaborating with our volume editors. You know, people in the field of literature, we tend to be pretty solitary in how we do our work, and it's just very, very satisfying to be working with a team of other people all of whom are really good at what they're doing. Anyway, to me that was especially rewarding. I'll have to think for a minute about the hardest, Claire.
There were lots of practical difficulties, I suppose. Maura Hazlett, who edited the first volume, at one point described the business of composing the sections and organizing the chapters as playing three-dimensional chess. And I'm not very good at chess, so there were definitely aspects of that to it. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think just the level of selectivity that was forced on us, that was maybe the hardest part.
Maybe a question that links to that question of selectivity. The word Irish writing rather than Irish literature were used by the Field Day anthologists. Did you ever think about using such language, given your interest in expanding the notion of what is imaginative writing? I know it's kind of a question about expansion, but you were also forced, of course, to limit things at the same time.
I think that's a really interesting one, and that's kind of, obviously that's a debate, and the Field Day choice came at a particular moment where the idea of kind of broadening our understanding of textuality after both kind of post-colonialism and post-structuralism, I suppose, seemed an important one. But actually for us, especially as we were, as I said already, trying to kind of recover something of the texture of the literary past and equip ourselves to go back with the ability to make aesthetic choices and think about values and so on, literature remained more important. And I was especially interested for the period that, for the book I edited from 1780 to 1830, to be able to track actually how contentious a term that was then, Irish literature, and how it was coming into view. And Matt Campbell, in the introduction to his volume, kind of picks up on we have a sort of conversation across those two introductions about that issue, in particular the question which many people asked around 1800, which was, shouldn't the term Irish literature be reserved for books written in the Irish language? That's many people are saying that well into the 1820s. 1830s and 40s, people in the nation are saying things like, yes, it was written by someone who was born in Ireland, but is it native? Is it Celtic? All of those debates, and the ability now to sort of go back and recover those debates is really helpful, I think, because again, it stops us treating it as this. It's not just this kind of inert term. It's in itself in transition.
I wonder, since many of us teach or have taken courses in Irish literature, using that term, how has the editing of these volumes and bringing together this material shaped your own practice of teaching Irish literature? Has it made you reconsider any of your courses or your approaches to literature, to the teaching of literature?
I think one thing it maybe has done for me is to highlight the value of kind of provocative juxtaposition of things that might not appear to go together as a way of helping students think about text in Irish literature. In other words, initially some of the combinations might seem kind of jarring, but then if you kind of work through their relationship to one another, you can maybe see something that you wouldn't have seen by trying to pair texts that are similar.
I feel like it's just given me a whole load of new chapters to recommend to students. So.
Well, I think I might take one last question from the audience, and then I have a final question to kind of wrap things up. So the last question I see coming from the audience is, could you say anything more about how this moves beyond post-colonial studies, which I'm going to use to lead into my question, which is, you talked about this as a map to the past through literature, but how does it also give us a kind of map to where Irish studies might be going in the future? So we can use that as the concluding question and then wrap up from there.
Okay. Well, I mean, I guess part of the difficulty of trying to predict where something is going is that we don't really know. But there are a number of trends that I do think we see emerging in scholarship all over. So Claire mentioned sort of eco-criticism and climate change and kind of literary attention to that. That clearly, I think, to me, is going to be an increasingly important area of study. So I think we can definitely say that that's one of the directions that Irish literature will be going in. It's also worth noting that that gets us out of a kind of national frame and into, to the transnational, the global, and so on. So that's another consequence, I think, of moving away to some extent from the post-colonial models, is it's also moving you away from the national, the scale of the national. And, Claire mentioned this already, but we were very aware as we were working that this term Irish, right, is contested, is not entirely satisfactory, right? That maybe you're tempted to put it in quotation marks, or you're tempted to wonder if somebody does or does not count. But just the idea of Irish literature going global, right, in a way. The other one that that I think is also clearly not post-colonial and clearly not on a national level would be, I mentioned before, disability studies, which as a direction. Claire, do you want to add anything to that?
I'm just thinking about it. It's, I suppose, we were trying to avoid something that's very difficult to avoid in any kind of literary historical project, which is just putting forward a set of relatively kind of stable, repeatable truths, you know, the kind of things that are always said. And one of them in any kind of big project like this is something at the end about it's all competing narratives and we can't really tell and it's not fixed, you know. Marjorie and I in our own writing tried very hard to avoid saying that because it's a sort of a get out, I suppose. So I think what's most important for me, I think, is the kind of the work at different levels and on different scales. So there is a kind of certain maturity to the field, as I said, that allows us to come in like this, but it's not equally distributed across the century. So we know a lot more about 1980 around figures like, say, Seamus Heaney or Tom Murphy and so on, than we do about the stuff that's right up in front of our noses. And yet you have to there's still a tendency to kind of separate them out, to imagine a line between them. So we were trying to kind of bring things together, and where authors have been the beneficiaries of extensive scholarly research, say Swift or Edgeworth or Joyce or Yeats, then we could have different sort of approaches to those authors. But where work needed to be recovered or to be told in new ways, that was the approach adopted there. So I think I just go back to the idea of a kind of scholarly patterning of the kind of the literary texture of the Irish past, and hopefully encouraging people to re-engage with some of these writers in new ways.
And I think we're really hoping that you know, that the volumes will kind of incite other new kinds of research, and the people will continue to discuss and argue and so on based on what we've done here.
You're not settling the debates, but kind of starting some new ones. Mm-hmm. Well, that seems like a great place to end. Thank you so much to Marjorie Howes and Claire Connolly for talking with us. Congratulations on the publication of these volumes. One thing that is unfortunate about Zoom is we can't all clap, so you don't get to hear the sound of all of our applause, but we're silently clapping for you. Thank you.
And sorry, Kelly, I never got a chance to say when Marjorie did. Thank you so much to yourself, to Kevin, to Miriam Nyan, and to Glucksman House for hosting us. Thank you, and to everyone for listening.
And just a reminder too that there is the discount code, so if you want to purchase the volumes, link from the chat, and join us for our future events through Ireland House. Thank you.